In 1945, an Egyptian peasant made a discovery that would shake the foundations of Christianity forever. Buried in the sands of Nag Hammadi, a collection of manuscripts revealed secrets that the Church had tried to erase from history for nearly 2,000 years. Among these forbidden texts, a name emerged from the shadows: Marcion of Sinope. This man, practically unknown today, had dared to do the unthinkable in the 2nd century. He not only questioned the scriptures accepted by the early church, but created his own version of the Bible, completely rejecting the Old Testament. His audacity cost him not only excommunication, but the almost total erasure of his memory from Christian history. Marcion was no ordinary heretic. The son of a bishop, he possessed deep knowledge of the scriptures and considerable financial resources. His influence spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, attracting thousands of followers who saw in his teaching a purer truth than that preached by the official church. The church of the 1st centuries waged a fierce battle against his ideas. Fathers like Tertullian and Irenaeus dedicated years of their lives combating what they called the Marcionite heresy. Their writings revealed the terror they felt at the growing popularity of these doctrines considered blasphemous. If you're fascinated by historical mysteries that challenge everything we know about early Christianity, subscribe to the channel now. This is a journey through the best-kept secrets of Christian history, and you cannot miss a single episode of this revealing investigation. Marcion was born around 85 AD in Sinope, a prosperous port city on the Black Sea, in present-day Turkey. His father held the prestigious position of local bishop, placing the family among the most respected in the Christian community of the region. Ironically, it would be this very privileged religious environment that would lead Marcion to question the Christian faith.
Good father of a prosperous shipowner in Sinope, no little city in the province of Pontus, would shape the future great heretic of Christianity. From a young age, Marcion demonstrated a restless and questioning mind. While other sons of religious leaders docilely followed traditional teachings, he dove into the scriptures with disturbing intensity. His constant questions about apparent contradictions between the Old and New Testaments caused discomfort even in his own father. The family wealth, derived from Sinope's prosperous maritime trade, provided Marcion with access to rare manuscripts and texts that most common Christians would never see. He obsessively studied Paul's letters, meticulously comparing them with the teachings of other apostles and with Jewish scriptures. Around his early 20s, tensions with the local church leadership, including his own father, began to intensify. Marcion openly questioned why Christians should follow the laws and stories of a God he considered cruel and vindictive, so different from the God of love preached by Jesus Christ. The family and religious conflict was about to explode, forcing a decision that would change not only Marcion's life, but the course of all early Christian history. The year 110 AD marked the point of no return in Marcion's life. During a meeting of the Christian community of Sinope, he publicly presented his first theories about the dual nature of divinity. He argued that the cruel God of the Old Testament could not be the same loving God revealed by Jesus Christ in the New Testament. The reaction was immediate and violent. The local church leaders, including his own father, accused him of blasphemy and heresy. Young Marcion had crossed a red line that Christian orthodoxy could not tolerate. His words were not merely theological questions, they were a declaration of war against the foundations of established Christian faith. Excommunication came quickly. His own father, torn between paternal love and episcopal duty,
to banish his son from the Christian community. Marcion lost not only his family and social position, but also his inheritance and his place in Sinope society. But the expulsion, instead of breaking his spirit, only strengthened his conviction. Marcion interpreted the rejection as confirmation that his ideas were too true to be accepted by a corrupt church. He began to see himself as a misunderstood prophet, destined to restore true Christianity. With the financial resources he managed to preserve, Marcion left Sinope forever. His destination was Rome, the heart of the empire and nerve center of emerging Christianity, where he intended to find more receptive ears for his revolutionary message. In 138 AD, a middle-aged man disembarked at the port of Rome, carrying more than personal luggage. Marcion brought with him a considerable fortune and, more dangerously, a revolutionary theology that was about to shake the foundations of the Christian capital. The Roman metropolis, with its religious diversity and intellectual effervescence, seemed the perfect place for his ideas to flourish. Second-century Rome was a religious cauldron where dozens of Christian sects competed for legitimacy and followers. Gnostics, Ebionites, Montanans, and other currents preached their versions of Christian faith in private homes and catacombs of the city. For Marcion, this fragmentation represented a unique opportunity to establish his own interpretation of Christianity. His first strategy was genius in its simplicity. Marcion approached the official Church of Rome and made an extraordinary donation of 200,000 sesterces, a sum equivalent to a Roman senator's fortune. The money was bait to gain influence and access to the leadership circles of the local Christian community. Initially, his generosity was well received by the Roman presbyters. Marcion was seen as a pious benefactor, a prosperous Christian willing to invest in the expansion of the faith.
For several months, he attended church meetings, observing, learning, and carefully probing the ground for his future revelations. But Marcion had not come to Rome just to be another member of the congregation. He had much bigger plans, plans that would soon put the entire Roman Christian hierarchy on war footing against him. For 2 years, Marcion silently observed the Roman Church, but in 140 AD, he decided to reveal his true mission. In a meeting with the main Christian leaders of the city, he presented his most radical theory. There were 2 completely distinct and opposing gods governing human reality. This declaration caused a sepulchral silence in the room. The first god, according to Marcion, was the demiurge, the cruel creator of the material world described in the Old Testament. This vindictive and capricious being had created an imperfect universe full of suffering, war, and injustice. It was the God of Mosaic law, of the plagues of Egypt, of the universal flood, and of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The second God was the unknown Father, supreme and perfectly good, revealed exclusively through Jesus Christ. This transcendent God had nothing to do with material creation or with the Jewish scriptures. His only manifestation in human history had been sending Christ to save humanity from the clutches of the cruel demiurge. This radical dichotomy resolved, in Marcion's mind, all the apparent contradictions between the Old and New Testaments. They were not books about the same God, but about 2 completely opposing divinities. Christianity, therefore, should totally reject its Jewish heritage to exclusively embrace the Christian revelation.
The reaction of the Roman leaders was one of horror and indignation. Marcion was not simply proposing an alternative interpretation of the Scriptures. He was declaring war against the very concept of divine unity
that sustained the entire Christian theological edifice. Marcion's response to the rejection of his ideas was audacious beyond any precedent in Christian history. If the official church did not accept his theology, he would create his own version of the sacred scriptures. Between 140 and 144 AD, Marcion worked tirelessly on compiling what would be known as the first alternative biblical canon in history. His Bible was revolutionary in its simplicity and radicalism. Completely rejecting the entire Old Testament, which he considered the work of the inferior God, Marcion included only 2 sections, the Evangelion, an edited version of the Gospel of Luke, and the Apostolicon, 10 carefully selected and modified letters of Paul. The editing process was meticulous and relentless. Marcion removed all positive references to the Old Testament, to messianic prophecies, and to continuity between Jewish and Christian revelation. Verses that contradicted his dual theology were simply eliminated or rewritten to fit his radical interpretation. Luke was chosen as the only trustworthy evangelist because, being a Gentile and companion of Paul, he was less contaminated by Judaizing influences. Even so, Marcion cut the first chapters of the Gospel, which narrated Jesus' birth, considering them excessively linked to Old Testament prophecies. Paul's letters received similar treatment. Marcion saw in the apostle to the Gentiles the only true disciple of Christ, the one who had understood the radical separation between law and grace. But even Paul needed to be purified of later Judaizing interpolations. Marcion's Christology was as radical as his theology. For him, Jesus had not been born of a woman, nor possessed a real physical body. The Savior was a purely spiritual manifestation of the supreme God, who had assumed only the appearance of humanity, so as not to completely shock human beings with his divine nature.
The doctrine known as Docetism solved a fundamental problem in Marcionite theology. If the material world was the creation of the inferior and malevolent God, how could the perfect Christ assume a real physical body? The solution was simple. He never had. It was all just an illusion necessary for the salvific mission. Jesus had appeared suddenly in the world, already an adult, during the 15th year of Tiberius's reign. There were no genealogies, virgin birth, or childhood, because these narratives were later inventions to artificially connect Christ to Old Testament prophecies. The true Savior did not need Jewish credentials. The crucifixion, though real in its salvific effects, had been a cosmic theater. The cruel demiurge thought he was destroying the envoy of the supreme God, but was actually being deceived. Christ's apparent death was the final blow that freed humanity from the clutches of Mosaic law and imperfect creation. This interpretation particularly attracted those Christians who struggled to reconcile divine perfection with human suffering. If Christ had not really suffered, his divinity remained intact, and his salvific mission became even glorious. In July 144 AD, the patience of the Roman Church came to an end. During an extraordinary council convened specifically to deal with the Marcion problem, the presbyters of the city formally declared his excommunication. The decision was unanimous and irrevocable. His doctrines were incompatible with genuine Christian faith. The process was conducted with ritual solemnity. Marcion was called to appear before the assembly of Christian leaders to defend his positions. For hours, he argued passionately about the necessity of purifying Christianity from its Jewish contaminations. His words were eloquent, but fell on ears already decided to reject him. The formal accusation included multiple heresies: theological dualism, Christological docetism, rejection of sacred scriptures, and creation of an alternative canon. Each point was considered sufficient for excommunication. Together, they represented an existential threat to emerging Christian orthodoxy. The Roman Church also made a powerful symbolic decision. It fully returned the 200,000 sesterces that Marcion had donated years before. This attitude demonstrated that orthodoxy could not be bought, and that no amount of money would justify tolerance of such serious heresies. But excommunication, instead of destroying Marcion, completely freed him. He no longer needed to feign conformity or moderate his positions. He was free to establish his own church, his own hierarchy, and his own version of early Christianity. Marcion's response to excommunication was extraordinary in its ambition and effectiveness. Within a few months, he established a network of alternative churches that would spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. His organization rivaled, and in many regions numerically surpassed, the official church itself. The Marcionite ecclesiastical structure was meticulously planned. Marcion appointed bishops for the main cities of the empire, established specific liturgies based exclusively on his edited version of the scriptures, and created a clerical formation system that guaranteed the doctrinal purity of his followers. His churches offered something that many Christians of the time longed for: theological simplicity and liberation from the complex questions of the Old Testament. It was no longer necessary to explain why the God of love permitted genocides, or why Jesus needed to fulfill obscure prophecies. Everything became crystal clear in Marcionite dual theology. The message found especially fertile ground among Gentile Christians, who had always felt uncomfortable with Christianity's Jewish heritage: Greek merchants, artisans. While Marcion disappeared in the official church records, his heretical creation began a clandestine journey through the centuries. Fragmented manuscripts of his alternative Bible were secretly copied by sympathetic scribes. These documents circulated in closed circles, passing from hand to hand like spiritual contraband. Official persecution only intensified the fascination with his forbidden teachings. In remote monasteries of Syria and Egypt, rebel monks preserved partial copies of Marcionite texts. They risked excommunication and even life to keep alive the memory of this radical interpretation of Christianity. Secret libraries housed these manuscripts, along with other writings considered heretical. The prohibition itself made the material even more valuable to collectors of forbidden knowledge. During the medieval period, Islamic scholars discovered some of these texts in abandoned libraries of Christian communities. Fascinated by the alternative perspective on Jesus and Paul, they translated fragments into Arabic. These translations preserved aspects of Marcionite thought that had been completely erased from the Western Christian world. Ironically, it was the infidels who saved part of Christianity's most radical heresy. In the 15th century, Renaissance humanists began to rediscover references to Marcion in ancient patristic texts. They realized that the vehement criticisms of the Church Fathers revealed, between the lines, the contours of a completely different theology. These fragmentary clues awakened curiosity about the man who had dared to rewrite the sacred scriptures.
The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century created an intellectual environment more conducive to questioning established ecclesiastical authority. Some reformers, while rejecting Marcionite theology, recognized the courage of his challenge to tradition. This shift in perspective would prepare the ground for a more objective reassessment of Marcion's historical figure. In the 18th century, a new generation of archaeologists and manuscript hunters embarked on expeditions throughout the Middle East. They sought not only material treasures, but documents that could revolutionize understanding of early Christian history. In forgotten caves and ruins of ancient libraries, fragments of texts that the Church had tried to erase forever began to emerge. German scholar Adolf von Harnack became obsessed with Marcion's theology.
A figure in the late 19th century. He spent decades collecting every reference, every citation, every criticism found in the writings of the Church Fathers. Gradually, he managed to reconstruct the contours of the Marcionite parallel Bible, like an archaeologist assembling a broken vase from scattered shards. Harnack made a shocking discovery. The version of the Gospel of Luke used by Marcion was significantly different from the canonical version. It lacked the narratives of Jesus' infancy, genealogies, and various passages that connected Jesus to the Old Testament. This raised a disturbing question. Had Marcion removed these passages? Or had the Church added them later to combat his influence? Archaeological excavations in Egypt brought to light ancient papyri containing fragments of non-canonical Gospels. Some of these texts showed affinities with Marcionite theology, suggesting that his influence had been much broader than official history admitted. Each archaeological discovery revealed new aspects of this underground current of early Christianity. The search for Marcion's lost manuscripts became a true academic treasure hunt. Libraries in Constantinople, monasteries on Mount Sinai, and private collections in Europe were scoured for any trace of the forbidden texts. Each discovered fragment was like a piece of a gigantic theological puzzle. In 1945, near the city of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, an Arab peasant made a discovery that would revolutionize the study of early Christianity. Buried in ceramic jars, he found a collection of ancient manuscripts written in Coptic. Although not directly Marcionite, these Gnostic texts revealed the theological diversity of the early Christian centuries, validating the existence of multiple interpretations of Christianity. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts showed that the early church had been a true ideological battlefield. Different Christian groups possessed distinct gospels, divergent interpretations about Jesus, and completely opposing views about the God of the Old Testament. Marcionism had not been an isolated aberration, but part of a much broader spectrum of alternative Christianities. Among the discovered texts, the Gospel of Thomas drew particular attention for presenting Jesus as a master of Gnostic wisdom, without references to crucifixion as expiatory sacrifice. This perspective echoed aspects of Marcionite Christology, where Jesus had come to reveal the true God, not to die for humanity's sins. The theological connections were undeniable. Scholars realized that many of the Gnostic texts shared with Marcion a negative view of the material world and the Creator God of the Old Testament. Although not identical in their teachings, they represented currents of thought that had questioned the same fundamental questions about the nature of God and the relationship between Old and New Testament. The discovery strengthened the position of academics who argued for the historical legitimacy of the questions raised by Marcion. If so many early Christian groups had struggled with the same theological problems, perhaps the man from Sinope was not simply an isolated heretic, but a representative of genuine and widespread theological concerns. In the 20th century, a new generation of academics began to propose revolutionary theories about Marcion and his relationship with the development of the New Testament. John Knox, professor at Union Theological Seminary, suggested that Marcion had played a crucial role in the formation of the Christian canon. According to his theory, the Church had been forced to define its sacred scriptures specifically in response to the Marcionite challenge. Knox's theory implied that without Marcion, Christianity might have developed a completely different relationship with the Old Testament. Perhaps the Church would never have felt the need to formalize a closed canon if it had not been confronted with Marcion's alternative Bible. This perspective transformed the heretic of Sinope from villain to involuntary catalyst.
The catalyst of Christian orthodoxy. Other scholars raised even more disturbing questions about the historical sequence of events. What if some of the heretical characteristics of the Marcionite Bible were actually older than the Orthodox versions? What if the Church had not only rejected Marcion, but also modified its own texts to combat his influence? These possibilities shook basic foundations of traditional Christian history. German scholar Ulrich Schmid proposed that the Gospel of Luke had undergone multiple revisions, some of which were motivated by the Marcionite controversy. If confirmed, this theory would suggest that our current canonical texts carry marks of the theological battle waged against Marcion in the 2nd century. The parallel Bible had indirectly influenced even the Orthodox Bible. These academic theories transformed Marcion from a historical footnote into a central figure for understanding the development of Christianity. International symposiums, academic books, and theological debates put the man banished from history back at the center of discussions about Christian origins. The silence imposed by the ancient church had finally been broken. If you want to understand how these discoveries are transforming our understanding of early Christianity, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Leave in the comments, do you believe that Marcion was unjustly condemned by history?
The Scriptures? Intense theological debates emerged at denominational conventions and pastoral conferences. The Catholic Church, with its emphasis on apostolic tradition, found ways to incorporate the new discoveries without compromising fundamental dogmas. Catholic scholars argued that divine providence had used even heretical opposition to guide the Church in the right direction. Marcion had served, inadvertently, God's purposes in forming orthodoxy. Progressive Christian movements embraced the discoveries as validation of their criticisms of literalist interpretations of the Scriptures. If the Bible itself had been formed through complex and contested historical processes, this opened space for more flexible hermeneutics. Marcion became, ironically, a posthumous ally of modern liberal theologians. In the Internet age, Marcion's ideas found a new platform for resurgence. Theological bloggers, alternative Christian podcasters, and YouTubers specializing in religious history began to explore his contributions to the development of Christianity. Online communities dedicated to the study of early Christianities proliferated, discussing aspects of his theology that had remained buried for 17 centuries. Academic publishers published modern translations of the reconstructed fragments of the Marcionite Bible. For the first time in almost 2 millennia, common readers could directly examine the texts that had caused such furor in the early church. These volumes, though academic, found an unexpectedly broad audience among Christians curious about the origins of their faith. International conferences on alternative Christianities began to include regular sessions on Marcion and his legacy. Scholars from prestigious universities presented research that continued refining our understanding of his theology and historical influence. The man banished from history had become a legitimate and respected field of study. Contemporary Christian movements found in Marcion historical precedent for their own criticisms of the Old Testament. Some progressive groups used his arguments to question biblical passages they considered morally problematic. Although they did not fully adopt
The Marcionite theology, they saw in him an example of a Christian who had dared to question texts considered sacred. The digitization of ancient manuscripts and the use of advanced textual analysis technologies promise new discoveries about Marcionite texts. International research projects continue searching for lost fragments of his parallel Bible in digital libraries and archaeological collections. The 21st century may still reveal completely unknown aspects of his work. Marcion's academic resurrection offers profound lessons for the 21st century church. His story demonstrates how movements that seem threatening can actually strengthen orthodoxy by forcing it to articulate its positions with greater clarity. Heretical opposition had served as a catalyst for fundamental theological developments that defined Christianity for subsequent millennia. The Marcionite case also illustrates the dangers of simply silencing dissenting voices instead of engaging their legitimate concerns. Although his theological solutions were problematic, the questions Marcion raised about violence in the Old Testament and apparent contradictions between testaments continue to challenge contemporary Christians. Perhaps a more constructive dialogue would have been more beneficial than summary excommunication. Modern denominations face their own Marcions, groups that question established interpretations and propose radical alternatives. History suggests that these tensions, though uncomfortable, can be productive if managed wisely. Isolation and condemnation rarely eliminate genuine theological concerns. They only force them underground. Marcion's parallel Bible also highlights the importance of understanding how the biblical canon developed historically. Contemporary Christians benefit from understanding that their sacred scriptures were formed through complex human processes, guided by divine providence, but not immune to historical and theological considerations specific to their contexts. Finally, Marcion's academic resurgence demonstrates that historical truth has a way of emerging even when suppressed for centuries. The contemporary church would be wise to embrace transparency and honesty about its history, including uncomfortable chapters, instead of trying to suppress it.
bury problematic aspects of its past. 17 centuries after his death in exile, Marcion of Sinope had achieved something few heretics achieve: lasting relevance. His parallel Bible, though fragmented and reconstructed from critical citations, continued generating academic debates and challenging assumptions about Christian origins. The man who had been banished from official history became an indispensable figure for understanding. Marcion's legacy teaches us a fundamental lesson about the nature of faith and truth. His story demonstrates how a single radical interpretation can shake the foundations of an entire religion, forcing it to define its own boundaries. The man who created a parallel Bible was not just a forgotten heretic, but a catalyst who shaped Christianity forever. His invisible influence persists on every page of the New Testament we know today. The final irony of Marcion's story is that in trying to purify Christianity, he inadvertently strengthened it. His ideas forced the early church to articulate its theology more clearly and systematically. The biblical canon we have today exists in part as a response to his theological provocations. The historical banishment he suffered
paradoxically guaranteed his permanent influence on the structure of Orthodox Christianity. Today, when we examine contemporary theological debates, echoes of the questions raised by Marcion still resonate. Tensions between Old and New Testament, discussions about the nature of God, and conflicts between law and grace continue to challenge Christian thinkers. Marcion's intellectual ghost haunts these discussions, reminding us that fundamental questions rarely find simple or definitive answers.
Traditions throughout the centuries. The man who was banished from official history actually never completely disappeared. Marcion remains alive in the structures, debates, and definitions that his controversial presence helped create. His parallel Bible may have been destroyed, but his influence on the Bible that survived is indelible. This is the final revelation. Sometimes those who are forgotten leave the deepest marks on human history.